My husband confessed, "My secretary is pregnant with my child. I'm leaving and taking everything." My lawyer begged me, "Don't give up." But I silently signed every document. He didn't know I had already won when I... Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also, let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always ask me what my secret was. A beautiful home in Scottsdale, Arizona. A husband who wore Italian suits and opened car doors. 2 kids in private school. A golden retriever named Biscuit who never barked at the wrong time. From the outside, my life looked like something you'd pin on a vision board. My name is Claire Hartwell. I was 41 years old and I had spent 17 years building something I believed in completely. Daniel and I had met in our mid-20s at a mutual friend's barbecue. He was charming in that effortless way some men are. The kind of charm that makes you think you earned it just by being chosen. We married young, struggled young, and grew together. Or so I thought. I worked as a licensed interior designer with my own small firm, Hartwell Interiors. Not glamorous by national standards, but respected locally. I had 15 regular clients and a waiting list. I was good at what I did. I was also good at being a wife, a mother, and at ignoring things I wasn't ready to see. The first sign came 14 months before everything collapsed. Daniel started working late, not occasionally, constantly. 3-4 nights a week, he'd text around 6:30, running behind. "Don't wait up." I didn't think much of it at first. His company, a mid-sized commercial real estate firm, had just taken on a large development project in Phoenix. Stress was reasonable. Overtime was reasonable. I told myself reasonable things. Then came the phone. He'd always left it on the kitchen counter at night, face up, unlocked. That was just how we were. No secrets, no locks. Sometime around month 2 of the late nights, the phone moved. To his nightstand, face down, password protected. When I mentioned it once, lightly, he said the IT department had enforced new security protocols company-wide. I nodded and went back to my book. Was I foolish? No. I was choosing peace. There's a difference, though it took me a long time to see it. The second sign was subtler but uglier. He stopped touching me, not in a dramatic movie-style way where you notice it immediately, slowly, the hand on my back when we walked into a restaurant, gone. The kiss that used to linger an extra half-second before he left for work, gone. Sex became infrequent, then mechanical, then absent. When I brought it up one evening, gently, he said he was exhausted, that the project was killing him, that he'd make it up to me when things settled down. Things never settled down, of course. By month 5, I had started paying closer attention. Not snooping, not yet, just noticing. His dry cleaning started coming back with a different smell. Not perfume exactly, something softer. A fabric softener I didn't use. He bought a new gym bag and started going to the gym on Saturday mornings, which was something he had never done in 17 years of marriage. When I offered to join him once, he looked startled in a way that lasted exactly 1 second too long before he smiled and said the gym was chaotic on weekends. I told myself I was paranoid. I threw myself into a kitchen renovation project for a client in Paradise Valley. I volunteered at my son Ethan's school. I took my daughter Maya to her swim meets and stood in the bleachers and cheered until my voice gave out. I was performing normalcy so hard that I actually convinced myself, for stretches of days at a time, that everything was fine. And then came the Tuesday in March. I came home early from a client meeting that had been canceled last minute. The house was empty. Kids at school, Daniel supposedly at the office. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen island, and I did something I had never done before. I opened his laptop, which he'd left on the counter, and I looked. I wasn't ready for what I found. I closed it before I finished reading. My hands were shaking so badly I spilled the tea across the marble. I had just enough time to compose myself before Daniel walked through the front door that evening. He was earlier than usual, which should have been a relief. He set his briefcase down, loosened his tie, and poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon without offering me any. Then he turned around, leaned against the counter, and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It was the look of a man who had already made his decision and was only now delivering the news. "Claire," he said, "we need to talk." He told me his secretary, a 29-year-old named Britt Larson, who I'd met exactly once at a company holiday party, was pregnant with his child. He told me it had been going on for almost a year. He told me he was leaving, and then he said the words that turned my blood to ice water. "I've already spoken to my attorney. The business assets, the investment accounts, the house, it's all structured in my name, Claire. I'm taking everything." He wasn't asking. He was announcing. And I sat there, perfectly still, and said nothing. After Daniel said what he said, he poured himself a second bourbon, walked into his home office, and closed the door. Like I was already a ghost in my own house. I sat at that kitchen island for a long time. Biscuit came and pressed his warm head against my knee, and I put my hand on him and stared at the wall and did the thing that nobody tells you about grief. I cataloged. I made a mental inventory of everything I stood to lose, and the list was so long and so precise that it almost felt clinical. The house, 4,000 square feet in a quiet cul-de-sac, worth approximately $1.4 million in the current market. Daniel had insisted 11 years ago that the mortgage be taken out in his name alone because his credit score was higher at the time and the rate would be better. I had thought nothing of it. Why would I? We were a team. The investment accounts. We had 3. A brokerage account, a SEP IRA in Daniel's name tied to his business, and a joint savings account that held about $47,000. Only that last one had my name on it. The others, one of which contained over $380,000, belonged on paper to Daniel Hartwell alone. His business, Hartwell Commercial Properties, which he had founded 9 years ago with a $200,000 loan I had co-signed while working full-time to cover our living expenses during the lean years. The business that bore our shared last name. The business that was now, apparently, entirely his. And then there was Britt Larson, 29 years old, carrying my husband's child, and presumably already planning what color to paint the nursery in a house that might very well be mine. Was I frightened? I'm not going to lie to you and say I wasn't. I was terrified. Not in the way people are terrified in movies, not screaming, not throwing things. I was terrified in the quiet way, the way that settles behind your sternum and makes it hard to breathe deeply, the kind of terror that comes from suddenly seeing the structural weakness in a building you've lived in for nearly 2 decades. But somewhere underneath the terror, and this surprised me, there was something else. Anger. Clean, cold, and very, very focused. I did not sleep that night. Daniel moved himself into the guest room without being asked, which I noted with grim practicality. I lay in our king-sized bed and I thought. Not about the marriage. Not about Britt. Not about the baby. I thought about the law. Here is what saved me. I am not, by nature, a passive person. I am someone who reads the fine print on contracts. I am someone who, when we renovated our kitchen 8 years ago, personally reviewed every subcontractor's license and liability policy before signing anything. I have a meticulous mind dressed in a calm face, and Daniel, in all his arrogance, had confused my calmness for weakness for 17 years. That was his first mistake. By 3 a.m, I had made a decision. I was not going to cry. I was not going to beg. I was not going to fight in the loud, visible way that Daniel was probably expecting. The screaming, the accusations, the performance of a wounded wife that he could point to later and say, "See, she's unstable." I was going to be so quiet and so thorough and so strategic that by the time he realized what I had done, it would already be done. The first thing I did at 7 the next morning was call my sister, Donna, who lived in Tempe and worked as a paralegal at a family law firm. I didn't tell her everything. Not yet. I just asked her one question. Who is the best divorce attorney in Maricopa County? She didn't hesitate. Renata Voss, she said. She's terrifying. In a good way. I called Renata Voss's office before 9. Her assistant told me the earliest available consultation was in 3 weeks. I said I understood, left my name and number, and asked to be put on the cancellation list. Then I went upstairs, showered, dressed professionally, and went to work. I had a client presentation at 10. I delivered it perfectly. My hands did not shake. That evening, while Daniel was in his office on a call, I went to my firm's filing cabinet and retrieved every document I had ever signed in relation to our shared finances. The co-sign agreement on his business loan, the mortgage application records I'd been CC'd on, the tax returns I had filed jointly for 16 years. I made copies of everything. I put the copies in my car. That was day 1. And here is what Daniel did not know. The co-signature on that $200,000 business loan was not just a liability. Under Arizona community property law, it was a thread, and I intended to pull it. 3 days after Daniel's announcement, Renata Voss's assistant called. There had been a cancellation. Could I come in Thursday at 2? I rearranged 2 client appointments without explanation and drove to Renata's office in downtown Phoenix. The building was glass and steel, the kind of place designed to make you feel that serious people worked inside it. Renata herself was in her mid-50s, small with silver-streaked hair pulled back severely and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She shook my hand with a grip that meant business and told me to sit down. "Tell me everything," she said. "Leave nothing out." I told her everything. It took 45 minutes. She took notes and didn't interrupt except to ask precise, practical questions. What state was the business incorporated in? Were there prenuptial agreements? Had any assets been transferred recently? What was my annual income, and what had it averaged over the past 5 years? When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me over her glasses. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said, "your husband has made a very common mistake that men in his position make. He has confused asset titling with asset ownership. Arizona is a community property state. With very few exceptions, anything acquired during the marriage belongs equally to both spouses, regardless of whose name is on the paperwork." I felt something loosen in my chest. "The business loan co-signature," I said, "is extremely useful," she confirmed, "as is every joint tax return you filed, because by filing jointly, he declared that income as marital. We'll need a forensic accountant, and we'll need to move quickly before he starts restructuring." She said that last part with a particular weight that I understood immediately. Before he starts restructuring, meaning before he hides things. "How quickly?" I asked. "Yesterday," she said. I retained Renata Voss that afternoon. The retainer fee was $7,500. I paid it from my personal business account, the one tied solely to Hartwell Interiors, which was in my name alone, which I had been quietly building for 11 years. Daniel had always dismissed my firm as a hobby business. He had never thought to look at its balance sheet. That was his second mistake. The forensic accountant Renata recommended was a man named Gerald Park, who worked out of a beige suite in Tempe and spoke so softly you had to lean forward to hear him. Within a week, Gerald had begun pulling apart the financial architecture of Daniel's business. What he found, even in those first days, was already interesting. 3 recent transfers to a subsidiary LLC that had been created 8 months ago. Around the same time, I noted that Britt Larson would have discovered she was pregnant. Meanwhile, at home, the atmosphere had changed in ways I hadn't expected. Daniel had hired his own attorney, a man named Scott Reeves, who had a billboard on the I-10 and the energy of someone who won by exhausting people. Daniel told me this one morning in the kitchen, casually while pouring coffee, watching my face for a reaction. I gave him none. I said, "Okay," and looked at my phone. He didn't like that. I could see it unsettling him, my stillness. He'd been expecting crying, bargaining, fury. He had been expecting something he could manage. What he got was a woman who smiled at him politely over breakfast and then drove to her lawyer's office. I watched him in those early days start to watch me, a new wariness in his eyes. He began checking the mail before I could. He came home earlier for a few days, as if he might catch me doing something. He was right to be uneasy, but he was looking in the wrong place. The point of no return came on a Thursday evening, 10 days after I'd retained Renata. Gerald Park called me while I was parked outside Maya's swim practice. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said quietly, "I found something you need to see." He emailed me 4 documents before I'd even put the car in reverse. They were bank transfer records, not from the business, but from a personal account of Daniel's that I hadn't known existed. A separate account, opened 6 years ago, at a different bank than the one we used jointly. 6 years of transfers. Small amounts at first, then larger. Over the 6-year period, he had moved approximately $340,000 out of what should have been our shared financial estate. Destination, a trust account. Beneficiary. Not named in the documents Gerald had pulled, but Renata told me the next morning after her own research that the trust had been established for a minor child, not our children. I sat with that number, $340,000, for a long time. 6 years. He had been planning this, or something like it, for 6 years. Whatever Britt Larson was or wasn't to him before, he had been building an exit for half a decade. I forwarded the documents to Renata and texted her one line: "We proceed." There was no going back now, and I didn't want to go back. Renata moved fast. That was what I had paid for, and she delivered. Within 2 weeks of our discovery of the hidden account, she filed for divorce in Maricopa County Superior Court and simultaneously filed a motion for a preliminary injunction, a legal freeze on all marital assets, including Hartwell commercial properties. Gerald Park's documentation of the transfers went into the filing. Every wire transfer, every date, every amount. Daniel found out on a Friday afternoon from his attorney Scott Reeves, presumably via a call that did not go well. I know this because Daniel came home that evening with a face I had never seen on him in 17 years. Not anger, exactly. Something more volatile than that. Something that comes before anger. The moment when a man realizes the board is not arranged the way he thought it was. He found me in the kitchen, helping Maya with homework. "We need to talk," he said. "Now." I looked at Maya. "Go finish in your room, sweetheart." She gathered her things without argument. She was perceptive, my daughter always had been, and I waited until I heard her door close. Then I turned to Daniel and waited. "You froze my accounts," he said. "You froze my business." "My attorney filed a motion," I said. "It's a legal process. You're trying to destroy everything I've built." "Daniel," my voice was level, "you moved $340,000 into a private trust account over 6 years. The court has those records now." The silence that followed was very long. He tried several tactics in rapid succession. I watched them cycle across his face like weather systems. First, outrage, then something closer to pleading, then a cold, deliberate shift into threat. "Scott says if you push this, we go to trial, full discovery. Your little business, your income, everything goes under the microscope. You really want that?" "Yes," I said. "I do." He stared at me. I think he was genuinely looking for the woman he thought he knew, the one who smoothed things over, who prioritized peace, who would eventually come to the table and accept something reasonable just to end the discomfort. He did not find her. What happened next, I hadn't anticipated. The following Monday, I arrived at my studio to find a letter from an attorney I'd never heard of, a firm out of Scottsdale called Mercer and Holt. The letter was addressed to Hartwell Interiors, LLC. It alleged that I had used jointly owned marital funds to capitalize my business, and that Daniel Hartwell was therefore entitled to a 50% equity stake in my firm as a marital asset. He was trying to take my business, the one thing that was mine. I called Renata before I'd finished reading the letter. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Interesting move. Desperate, but interesting. Forward it to me. We'll respond." Her response, filed 3 days later, included my original business incorporation documents, every tax return from Hartwell Interiors, and a detailed accounting showing that my firm had been capitalized entirely from my personal design commissions predating the period in question. She also included an affidavit from my accountant going back 9 years. Mercer and Holt went quiet after that. Scott Reeves, I later learned from Renata, had reportedly told Daniel the play was unlikely to succeed and was only going to generate legal fees. That was the first time the antagonists retreated, but it had cost me. Not financially, Renata had handled it efficiently, but in a way I hadn't expected. The letter about my business had shaken me more than almost anything else, because Hartwell Interiors wasn't just income. It was the proof that I existed independently of Daniel, that I had built something. The idea that he could reach in and claim it, even unsuccessfully, made my hands shake in a way they hadn't since the beginning. I called my sister Donna that night and told her I needed a few days. I drove to Sedona on a Wednesday morning. I booked a small room at a quiet inn outside the main strip, the kind of place with thick walls and no room service, and a trail out the back door. I hiked for 2 days. I sat by the creek and I let myself feel everything I had been carefully holding at arm's length. The grief, the humiliation, the exhaustion of being strategic when you are also heartbroken. I cried finally, a lot, and privately. And then, on the 3rd morning, I had breakfast on the porch, watched the red rocks go gold in the early light, and drove back to Phoenix, ready. When I returned from Sedona, there was a voicemail on my phone from a number I didn't recognize. The message was from Britt Larson. I had to listen to it twice because I couldn't quite believe what I was hearing on the first play. Her voice was softer than I expected, younger sounding, slightly uncertain. She said she understood things were complicated and that she and Daniel both wanted to resolve everything out of court, quietly, for everyone's sake. She said she was 7 months pregnant and very stressed, and that she hoped we could talk, woman to woman. She said Daniel was prepared to be very generous if I would agree to a mediated settlement without going to trial. She left her cell number. I stood in my kitchen, the kitchen with the marble countertop I had chosen myself, the backsplash I'd sourced from a tile importer in Tucson, and I thought about what kind of calculation goes into a phone call like that. What had Daniel told her to say? Had it been her idea? Was she frightened? Or was she a willing participant in a strategy designed to soften me up at the moment when he thought I was most vulnerable? Just returned from a few days away, perhaps weakened, perhaps lonely? Was I supposed to feel sympathy for her? Some part of me, stubbornly human, did feel something. She was 29 and pregnant and attached to a man who had just had his financial empire frozen by a court order. That was not a comfortable position, but sympathy and strategic capitulation are two entirely different things, and I had learned in the past several weeks to be very precise about that distinction. I did not return her call. I forwarded the voicemail to Renata, who noted it for the record and told me to have no direct communication with either Daniel or Britt outside of official legal channels. "They are feeling the pressure," she said. "This is what pressure looks like." I thought about that for a long time. Pressure. I had been living inside it for weeks. The frozen mornings over breakfast with a man who was a stranger, the careful management of my children's confusion, the constant vigilance required to be both wounded and strategic. What did pressure look like from the other side of the table? Apparently, it looked like Britt Larson calling me to talk woman to woman. The following week, I had lunch with 3 women I had known for years. Carol, who had been my closest friend since our children were in preschool together. Diane, who was a former client turned genuine friend, and my sister Donna, who drove in from Tempe and brought a bottle of wine she'd been saving for what she called a significant occasion. We sat on Carol's back porch on a warm April afternoon, and I told them everything. Not the strategic details, those stayed with Renata, but the human shape of it. The year of slow signals I'd talked myself out of. The night Daniel had stood in my kitchen and announced my life was over. The letter about my business. Sedona. Carol cried before I finished. Donna refilled everyone's wine without being asked. Diane, who had been through her own divorce 8 years ago, sat quietly through most of it. And then when I was done, she said something that I wrote down afterward and kept. "The hardest part," she said, "isn't the legal fight. It's the loneliness of being competent. Everyone assumes you're fine because you're functioning. No one brings you casserole when you're handling it." I laughed at that, really laughed, for the first time in weeks, and it felt like something cracking open in a good way. They didn't offer me advice about what to do. They didn't tell me to be careful or to consider compromising, or that I should think about the children as if I had somehow forgotten them. They sat with me. They treated me like a person who was going through something serious and handling it seriously, and also needed someone to witness it. I drove home that evening feeling, for the first time, that I was not entirely alone in this. My children were with Daniel that week. We had established an informal rotating schedule that Renata had structured carefully to ensure I had documented consistent parenting time. The house was quiet when I got home. I fed Biscuit, poured myself a glass of water, and sat at the kitchen island. I had been sitting in this same spot when I first found out the truth. It felt different now. I was still afraid, but the fear had changed shape. It was no longer the kind that paralyzed. It had become the kind that clarifies. I opened my laptop and began reviewing the forensic documents Gerald Park had prepared for Renata's next filing. I was ready for whatever came next. They came on a Sunday. I heard the car in the driveway just after 11 in the morning, a sound I recognized as Daniel's Audi. that particular engine note I'd lived alongside for a decade and a half. I was in the living room with a cup of coffee and the financial documents I'd been reviewing, and I had exactly 3 seconds to decide how I wanted to be found before the doorbell rang. I stacked the documents face down, set them on the side table, and went to the door. It was both of them. Daniel stood slightly forward, dressed in the kind of casual clothing that was obviously deliberate: jeans, a soft gray sweater, the visual language of approachability. Britt stood half a step behind him in a maternity dress, her stomach unmistakably round, her expression arranged into something that was trying very hard to look sincere. She was prettier than I remembered from the holiday party. I registered this with the clinical part of my brain, the part that had been very busy for the past several weeks. "We'd like to talk," Daniel said, "without the lawyers. Just as people." I looked at them both for a moment. I thought about calling Renata. I thought about closing the door. I thought about the 12 different ways this conversation was designed to disadvantage me. Then I opened the door wider and said, "Come in." If you're going to understand your opponent, sometimes you have to let them play their hand. I did not offer them coffee. I sat in the armchair across from the couch where they settled, and I waited. I had learned in the past 2 months that silence is a tool. Most people cannot tolerate it and will fill it with things they hadn't planned to say. Daniel spoke first. He had clearly rehearsed. He said that he knew he had hurt me and that he was sorry. Not for wanting to move forward, but for how it had happened. He said the situation had become unnecessarily adversarial and that this wasn't what either of them wanted. He said the children deserved better than a protracted legal war. He said, and this was the part that was clearly Britt's contribution, that a new baby was coming into the world and it would benefit everyone if the two families could find a way to coexist peacefully. He pushed a folder across the coffee table toward me. "Scott has put together a settlement offer," he said. "Generous. Considerably more than you'd likely get if we go to trial and the judge decides the business is a sole proprietorship." I looked at the folder but didn't touch it. I noticed, in that moment, the small stagecraft of their arrangement on my couch. Daniel leaning slightly forward, elbows on knees, performing sincerity. Britt with one hand resting on her stomach, whether consciously or not, making the pregnancy visible, central, unavoidable. Was the hand placement deliberate? I couldn't know, but I knew how it was designed to make me feel guilty, obsolete, unreasonable for fighting against something as inevitable as a new life entering the world. It was, I thought, quite well constructed. That was when Britt spoke. Her voice was steady, steadier than on the voicemail. She had composed herself. She said she knew this was painful and that she had a lot of respect for what I had built as a wife and mother. She said Daniel had spoken about me with great admiration, always. She said she wasn't my enemy. And then she said something that I suspect she thought would land as generosity but revealed everything. "At the end of the day, Claire, you're 41. Starting over is hard. This offer protects your lifestyle. It protects your stability. Daniel just wants this resolved so he can focus on his family." His family. I sat with that phrase in my mouth like a stone. She had just told me, in the gentlest possible language, that I was the past, that I was a loose end to be managed, that the future belonged to them and their child, and the most dignified thing I could do was accept a settlement, their settlement on their terms, and step aside gracefully. The word lifestyle particularly struck me, as though what I had spent 17 years building was a lifestyle, an aesthetic preference, a habit rather than a life, as though I could be bought out of my own history with a number on a page and a soft voice delivering it. I picked up the folder. I opened it. I read the first 2 pages, which outlined an offer that was, I will admit, not nothing, but it excluded the hidden trust account entirely. It offered me 40% of the marital home's equity, not 50%. It treated Daniel's business as solely his, and it included a confidentiality clause that would prevent me from discussing the financial circumstances of the divorce. In other words, take the money and be quiet. I closed the folder. I set it back on the coffee table. Thank you for coming, I said. My attorney will be in touch. Daniel's composure cracked first. His jaw tightened. He said, very quietly, very controlled, which was somehow worse than shouting, that I was making a serious mistake, that I should think carefully about what a trial would cost me, financially and emotionally, that my business would be scrutinized, that the children would be affected. He let that last point hang in the air the way people do when they want you to feel accused without having technically accused you of anything. I had seen that rhetorical move before. I recognized it now for what it was, the final tool in an empty box. Britt put her hand on his arm and they stood. At the door, Daniel turned back once. The softness was gone entirely. You're going to regret this, he said. I closed the door, turned the lock, and stood in my hallway. My heart was pounding. I won't pretend otherwise. There was real fear in that moment, the fear of someone who has just refused a door that won't open again, who is now committed entirely to a path that has no comfortable exits. My palms were damp. My jaw was tight. For a few seconds, I stood completely still and simply let the fear be there, because I had learned that fighting it only made it louder. Then I breathed through it. And as I breathed, the fear became something else. It became certainty. I picked up my phone and called Renata. They came to the house, I said. I have things to tell you. The trial date was set for a Thursday in late September. Renata had spent the preceding 6 weeks in a state of quiet, devastating preparation. Gerald Park had completed his forensic accounting report, a 47-page document that traced every significant financial transaction in Daniel's professional and personal accounts over 11 years of marriage. The hidden trust account. The subsidiary LLC created 8 months before he confessed the affair. A second LLC, which Gerald found in month 4 of his investigation, that had been used to funnel consulting fees from Hartwell Commercial Properties into a separate account that had no visible connection to Daniel's name until you followed the LLC registration documents back through 2 layers. 2 layers. He had tried to be careful. He had not been careful enough. Renata also had something else, a deposition from Daniel's former business partner, a man named Ray Guzman, who had left Hartwell Commercial Properties 3 years ago, under circumstances that had always seemed vague to me when Daniel mentioned it. Ray Guzman, it turned out, had left because of a financial dispute, specifically because he believed Daniel had diverted partnership funds. He had signed a non-disparagement agreement at the time and said nothing. But non-disparagement agreements, Renata told me, do not prevent testimony in civil proceedings when subpoenaed. Ray Guzman's deposition was 14 pages long. I did not attend Daniel's deposition. Renata did, with a second attorney from her firm. She called me afterward and said only he contradicted himself on the LLC formation dates. Twice. The night before the trial, I did not sleep well, and I didn't try to force it. I lay in my bed in the Tempe apartment, and I let my mind move through everything. The evidence, the timeline, the faces of my children. And then I got up at 5:30 and made coffee and sat by the south-facing windows while the sky turned from black to deep blue to the pale gold of an Arizona morning. I had done everything I could do. Every document, every deposition, every filing. What happened in that courtroom now would be the result of 6 months of careful, methodical work. I was not going to walk in there afraid of a result I had already done everything to earn. The morning of the trial, I wore navy. I had thought about this deliberately. Not black, which reads as aggression, not gray, which reads as uncertainty. Navy is the color of someone who intends to be taken seriously. I arrived with Renata and sat at the plaintiff's table and did not look at Daniel's side of the room until I was settled. When I did look, finally, I saw Scott Reeves speaking rapidly into Daniel's ear, and Daniel nodding with the too careful stillness of a man who has been coached but is afraid. Britt was not in the courtroom. I had expected her. She wasn't there. I found out later she had been placed on modified bed rest. I felt no satisfaction about that. She was carrying a child and her health was her health. But I noted her absence with the same precision I'd been noting everything for months. The judge was a woman in her early 60s named the Honorable Patricia Dunn. She'd been on the family court bench for 19 years. Renata had told me that Judge Dunn had a particular impatience for financial concealment in marital proceedings and had sanctioned attorneys for bringing weak cases in this area. Gerald Park testified for 2.5 hours. He was the most boring man I had ever loved in my life. He spoke in measured, precise sentences about transfer dates and LLC registration documents and the mathematical relationship between Daniel's declared income and his actual deposits. He had charts, clean, simple charts that a 10-year-old could follow. He walked Judge Dunn through the hidden account, the subsidiary LLC, the second LLC, and the trust. At one point, Judge Dunn asked Gerald to clarify the timeline of the second LLC's formation relative to the first asset transfer. Gerald answered without hesitation, in 2 sentences, and referenced the specific exhibit number. Judge Dunn wrote something down. Scott Reeves looked at his notepad. Scott Reeves cross-examined him for 40 minutes and accomplished nothing except confirming, by the precision of Gerald's answers, that the numbers were not in dispute. Then Daniel took the stand. He had been coached well, and for the first 20 minutes, he held together. He spoke about the LLCs as legitimate business structures, tax efficiency, asset protection, standard practice. He spoke about the trust as something established for future family planning, a phrase that his own attorney had clearly approved and which landed in the courtroom with an awkward weight that Scott Reeves didn't seem to notice, but Judge Dunn did. She looked up from her notes when he said it, just briefly, but I saw it. Renata's cross-examination was 11 minutes long. She asked him to confirm the date the first subsidiary LLC was created. He confirmed it. She asked him to confirm the date his personal account received the first transfer from that LLC. He confirmed it. She asked him to confirm the date of the conversation, documented in his own email entered into evidence, in which he discussed the LLC structure with his accountant. That date was 4 years before he claimed to have started thinking about restructuring. He said he didn't recall the exact date. Renata showed him the email on the screen. He said the email was taken out of context. She asked him to explain the context. He began to explain. The explanation contradicted what he had said under direct examination about when the LLC was formed. Renata asked him, very calmly, which version was accurate. He said both were, in different ways. She asked him to clarify. He clarified in a way that contradicted the second version. There was a silence in the courtroom that lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It felt considerably longer. Judge Dunn made a note. a long one this time. She wrote without looking up, and the sound of her pen moving across the page was the only sound in the room. Scott Reeves did not object. I think by that point he understood that objecting would only draw more attention to what had just happened. Daniel sat on the stand and looked at a point somewhere above the gallery, and his jaw was working slightly, the way it did when he was trying very hard to control his expression and not entirely succeeding. I had seen that jaw movement for 17 years. I knew exactly what it meant. I sat at the plaintiff's table and I did not move. I did not allow myself any visible reaction, not satisfaction, not relief, not the profound vindication that was rising in my chest like a tide. I was a woman in navy blue who had made a decision 6 months ago and had followed it, step by step, to this room. When Daniel stepped down from the stand, he did not look at me. Judge Dunn did not rule from the bench that day. She recessed and returned with her written ruling 17 days later. I was in Renata's office when the ruling came through electronically. Renata printed it. She handed it to me across the desk and watched my face as I read. 43 pages. I read every word. The ruling found that Daniel Hartwell had engaged in deliberate dissipation and concealment of marital assets over a period of no less than 6 years, as documented by the forensic accounting report submitted by Gerald Park. The hidden trust account, all $340,000 of it, was declared a marital asset and ordered included in the equitable distribution. The subsidiary LLC was pierced on the grounds that it had been created for the explicit purpose of shielding assets from marital division. The second LLC was similarly treated. The ruling cited specifically the inconsistencies in Daniel's trial testimony regarding the LLC formation timeline. The moment Renata's 11-minute cross-examination had quietly dismantled everything he'd spent months constructing. Judge Dunn used the phrase willful misrepresentation twice in the same paragraph. I read that paragraph 3 times. Because Arizona is a community property state, the default is 50-50 division. But Judge Dunn had discretion to deviate from that default in cases of documented financial misconduct, and she used it. I was awarded 60% of the total marital estate. This included 60% of the equity in the Scottsdale house, which we were ordered to sell within 90 days, 60% of the brokerage account, my full share of the joint savings, and the piece that Daniel's attorney had argued most strenuously against, a financial judgment representing my equitable contribution to the founding and growth of Hartwell Commercial Properties, calculated based on my co-signature of the original $200,000 loan, my years of financial support during the business's early years, and the increase in the business's value during the marriage. That judgment was $410,000. Daniel was also ordered to pay a portion of my legal fees on the grounds that his concealment of assets had necessitated the forensic accounting and prolonged the proceedings. Scott Reeves sat beside him and wrote things on a legal pad with the mechanical diligence of a man billing by the hour. I wondered briefly whether Daniel had any idea what Scott Reeves's bill was going to look like at the end of all this. The irony of paying your own attorney to watch you lose was not lost on me. The confidentiality clause from their settlement offer, the one that would have required me to be silent, was, of course, not part of this ruling. I was under no obligation to be quiet about anything. I did not cry when I read the ruling. I had done my crying in Sedona, in private, where it belonged. I shook Renata's hand. She said, "Well done," which from her was a standing ovation. Then she added quietly, setting the ruling back on her desk, "He underestimated you at every single stage. That's ultimately what this ruling reflects." I nodded. I had thought something similar, though I would have phrased it differently. He hadn't underestimated me exactly. He had never looked at me closely enough to form an estimate at all. 17 years, and he had never thought to consider what I was capable of when I had sufficient reason. In the weeks that followed, the practical machinery of the outcome ground forward. The house sold in 38 days. The Scottsdale market was still strong, and I had staged it myself professionally because I could not stop being good at my work even in the middle of all of this. I chose the furniture arrangement, the lighting, the fresh flowers in the entryway. I stood in the kitchen, that kitchen with the marble countertop and the Tucson backsplash, for the last time on the morning of the final walkthrough, and I looked at it carefully and completely, and then I left. The sale closed, and my 60% arrived in my account. Daniel's response to the ruling was to file a motion for reconsideration, which was denied within 3 weeks, denied with a brevity that suggested Judge Dunn had not found the motion's arguments compelling. Scott Reeves, I was told by Donna through professional channels she declined to specify precisely, had advised Daniel that an appeal would be expensive and very likely unsuccessful given the documentation. Daniel did not appeal. I think by that point he was exhausted in the way that people become exhausted when they have spent months maintaining a version of events that the record has definitively disproved. That kind of exhaustion is different from ordinary tiredness. It comes from the inside. He did, however, stop wearing Italian suits to what remained of his professional life because it turned out that a company under asset freeze proceedings and the subject of a court ruling documenting financial misconduct was not viewed favorably by the commercial real estate community in Phoenix. 3 of his major clients quietly moved their business elsewhere. 2 of his investors asked questions he apparently couldn't answer to their satisfaction. The Henderson account, his most prestigious contract, the one he'd reference constantly at dinner parties as evidence of his success, was not renewed. The business survived, but it was wounded, scaled back, diminished. And Britt Larson? She had the baby in October. A boy. I knew this not because Daniel told me. We communicated exclusively through attorneys and a co-parenting app from that point forward, but because my daughter Maya mentioned it, carefully and with the evident caution of a child managing 2 worlds, over dinner one Sunday. I told Maya that was good news. I meant it. A child is a child, whatever the circumstances of its parents. I made sure my own children, Ethan and Maya, understood that the conflict had been between adults, about adult things, and that nothing about it reflected on them or on their right to love whomever they loved in their lives. That was the most important work I did. The legal work was strategy. The parenting work was love. By December, I had signed the last document, closed the last account, and updated the last record. I sat down at the kitchen island in my new apartment, smaller than the house, deliberate, mine, with a cup of tea, and I looked at the walls I had not yet decorated. I thought, where do I want to begin? My new apartment was in Tempe, 5 minutes from my sister Donna and 12 minutes from my studio. I had chosen it for those reasons, proximity to the people I wanted near, and also because it had south-facing windows that filled the main room with light until 4 in the afternoon. I painted the walls myself that first December, a warm off-white in the main room, deep terracotta in the hallway, sage green in the bedroom that Daniel had always vetoed. I stood on a stepladder with a roller and a playlist and felt, absurdly, like one of the freest versions of myself I had ever been. Hartwell Interiors had its best year in 2024. The firm grew. I was featured in a regional architecture magazine in March, expanded into a second office suite by June, and hired a junior designer named Priya, who was 26, talented, and paid proper attention to detail. I didn't date for the first year. I didn't force it. I hiked on Sunday mornings while Daniel had the kids, driving out toward the McDowell Mountains and returning 2 hours later, feeling like I'd had a conversation with something larger than my problems. My children were resilient, not untouched, but resilient. Ethan had difficult months and I got him into therapy. Maya was angry for a while, which was appropriate, and we talked about it honestly. We were not perfect, and neither was I, and we were okay. And Daniel? He moved Britt and the baby, named Carter, into a smaller house in Chandler. The business continued contracting. The Phoenix commercial real estate community is not large, and word about the court ruling traveled. He lost the Henderson account in February. Money was tighter than Britt had expected. She had left her position at the firm, apparently anticipating a different financial reality than the one Judge Dunn had produced. They argued about money constantly, according to a mutual acquaintance who had no reason to invent details. I felt no joy in this. What I felt was something more neutral, the quiet recognition that choices have consequences, and this was consequence, not punishment. In September of the second year, I went on a date. A landscape architect named David, introduced by Diane at one of her dinner parties. We talked for 3 hours over dinner and then stood on the sidewalk for another 30 minutes because neither of us wanted to stop. He was kind in the unhurried way I had forgotten existed. I drove home and sat in my parking lot for a few quiet minutes. I thought, this is what the other side feels like. It felt genuinely like a beginning. If this story taught me anything, it's that silence is not surrender, and calm is not weakness. Daniel saw a woman giving up that night. He didn't see a woman who had already started counting, already started planning. He confused my stillness for defeat. Don't ever let anyone convince you that walking away from what you've built is the dignified choice, especially when the person asking isn't offering dignity. They're offering convenience. Theirs, not yours. What would you have done in my position? I'd genuinely like to know. Leave a comment below. If this story stayed with you, subscribe for more. And thank you, truly, for listening all the way to the end.